Hello everybody, we want to welcome you all into our RELO Cairo Mentors platform. Actually, we are so glad that you are joining us here today. And we want to welcome our guest of honor, Dr. Morrain, and I'm sending all my greetings to the whole team of RELO Cairo Mentors for their working day and night to facilitate everything for you. Thank you all for joining us. Let me introduce myself. I'm Anan AbdElRahman, RELO Mentor Trainer and RELO Cairo Mentors Platform Founder and Facilitator. Today, we're going to before we start, we're going to set some norms just to facilitate everything during the session. Kindly, your mics and cameras are going to be switched off to reduce the background noise. And if you have any question, just write it down in the chat box to make sure that we are going to answer it at the end of the session. Now we want to welcome Dr. Ran. Dr. Ran, he is an American professor and lives and works in Germany. He is the innovator of graphic facilitation concept, ready-made maps that promotes learning and teaching methodologies. For example, TBL, task-based learning, and PBL, project-based learning, content and language integrated learning, and content-based instruction. Ron started promoting the concept in the mid-90s in Germany, and since then he has been promoting the concept at conferences, universities, teacher workshops, and webinars internationally. He is also the founder of Business English Special Interests in Russia, which had its debut in Moscow in 2019. Welcome, Dr. Ran.
Anan, thank you very much for inviting me.
You're most welcome.
It's wonderful. I feel very excited to be able to reach the audience in Egypt, of course, and as I see a few other countries. I don't want to talk too much about myself. I want to get right into what we're going to do today, and that is, of course, talking about the power of mind maps in language learning and language teaching. And I would just like to start by asking a very simple question. Why can't I just stick to my conventional tried and tested techniques? Techniques like creating lists with students and maybe playing games with them. Well, there's nothing wrong with games, but how many games can we play before the students will start to get bored? And what about the concept of drill and kill, which of course is actually just repeating and repeating and repeating the same thing until, of course, the students get a little bit bored. And what about chalk and talk? Well, chalk and talk is about frontal teaching and how a teacher stands in front of the room. And of course, it's very teacher-oriented and not student-oriented. And then we have, let's give them a little bit of an online test, because isn't that integrating technology into the classroom? Well, how many tests can you give a student? And how are you going to check if they're really learning? What about gap exercises? Well, there's nothing wrong with gap exercises, but how many of those can we do? And does it bring really life into the learning? Does it really prove that a student is able to really comprehend and understand the language that we want them to learn? And multiple choice, well, that's not any different. It's just a little bit another activity that we can do with students. But does that bring life to a learning cycle? And of course, the tried and true and tested course book. I always get into this with teachers as I've traveled all over the world, met thousands of teachers, is so many publishing companies always promote the idea of a course book because this is what they believe, or at least teachers believe, that if I get to learn how to work that course book, that I will be a great teacher. Well, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble tonight, but I just want to say that I don't have anything against course books. I think course books are great, especially for young teachers who are barely learning how to teach. There's a lot of good things that are inside of a course book, but the idea of task-based learning and project-based learning and using mind maps to guide the learning goes away from the course book. So we use task-based learning and project-based learning with, of course, ready-made mind maps to guide that, to bring life into the learning cycle, to bring a different kind of dynamics other than just teaching with a book. And of course, the tried and true, very old-fashioned, conservative, conventional approach of everything centers around the teacher. The teacher is the middle point of the learning process. But, you know, it really isn't and shouldn't be that way. And I have to say that I'm approaching this with you this evening from the perspective of how we work with learning and teaching in Northern Europe. And we've moved away from teacher-centered approaches and moved more to student-centered approaches. And this is what this evening, this is all going to be about. So what people ask me all the time, well, tell me how mind maps work. Well, here are 12 reasons why maybe you should be using mind maps in your classroom. And one most important reason is we've got to learn how to flip the classroom. We've got to get away from the teacher-oriented kind of management that we do in the classroom and how we teach. And we want to drive the learning cycle with a meaningful goal. And I'm going to show you what meaningful really means. And number two is we want to create a positive learning dynamics that, again, getting away from that teacher-oriented kind of way of doing things where the teacher's the middle point, everybody's talking to the teacher, to learner-driven learning, where the learner is actually driving things. They're the ones who are managing basically not only their own learning, but the collaborative learning that should be taking place in the classroom. Now, when I say classroom, I want everybody to please understand that in today's world, the classroom also means online. And when I started the idea of ready-made mind maps, of course, I have been teaching online now for 15 years, and I never ever thought that we would have a situation where all teachers were going to be forced to work online. So number three, of course, is promote the existing skill sets and develop new skills during the learning cycle. We always concentrate as language being the number one thing that we should be teaching. But the thing is, we forget about all the other things that we should be teaching along with language. We forget sometimes how we learned our mother language and the skills that we learned along the way as we learned our mother language. And that's not any different with learning a second language. We try to separate language learning from skills learning. But I have to say, that is one of the reasons that many times teachers reach a point of frustration because they'll come to realize that you can't. You must always connect skills learning with language learning, and then at the same time help students to develop new skills, skills like research, content creation, curation, and of course the 4Cs, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. We've got to learn how to incorporate the concept of montage in the learning process. Now, I use the French word montage because that is what is used in the film industry. And one of the things that actually led me to create the concept of ready-made mind maps was the idea of montage, where we chunk things and storyboard things. When a great director is making a film, he always thinks things out and how he's going to film that film, and he creates little storyboards in order for the actors to understand what their roles are in the film and in the scenes as they're filmed. And that's not any different than what's going on in a classroom. Number 5, deal with personal learning preferences. We must respect the preferences that our learners bring to the table. Not everyone learns the same way. And by using ready-made mind maps in your learning cycles, whether they be face-to-face or online, we will be able to actually deal with the different personal learning preferences that many students bring to the classroom. Number 6, deal with differentiated learning. Now, if you're not familiar with the idea of differentiated learning, I ask you to please Google it because it is probably one of the most complicated things that goes on within a classroom. Again, whether that be face to face or online. So we have to understand what's really going on and the dynamics of differentiated learning and learn how to work with that and integrate the dynamics that that brings to the classroom in a positive way to make everyone feel like they're part of the learning process. Number seven, take advantage of experiential learning. Now, many of you might be working with young learners and might feel that maybe as a young learner, they might not have that much life experience to bring to the table, but they do. As I've traveled around the world and done experiments and research with young learners, and of course, I define young learners as anyone in the 5th class all the way to the 12th class, from about 11 years old to 19. And they do bring experience to the table. They do bring some know-how. And I have to say that young people today are very tech savvy. And they can be great teachers. So don't ever be opposed to reverse mentoring. In other words, letting a teenager teach you how technology works. Uh, and number 8, ready-made mind maps and task-based learning and project-based learning means that students and teachers need to stay focused and become result-oriented. In other words, they must have a goal, they have to set a goal, and then they have to keep their eyes on that goal as they're going through a learning cycle. And I'm using the term here, learning cycle, because we as teachers, in very conservative ways of thinking, always use the word lesson, and that the lesson lasts 45 minutes. But the thing is that we have to move away from that kind of thinking. Now, this is not just semantics. This is really about rethinking the way we feel and believe about learning and how long learning should be from the beginning to the end. So we use the term learning cycle because learning just doesn't last 45 minutes. Learning can last maybe 90 minutes or 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours. So this is what we call a learning cycle. We put many sessions together in order to come up with what is called a learning cycle. Number 9, put some life into that course book. How long can we use a course book? We go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3, and then all of a sudden we start to wonder, well, why are my students not coming to class anymore? Why are they making excuses they're not doing their homework? It could be because they're bored. Who wants to sit in a classroom and just go through a book? This is very unnatural. Now, different countries have different cultures of learning, and maybe, and this is of course scientifically proven, that many teachers teach the way they learned as a young person. So many of us come from cultures where we used course books, and that's the way we learned things. But the world has changed, and course books are important, but they're not everything, and they should never be the center of a learning cycle. Number 10, get away from predetermined outcomes and prescribed grammar. And that is one of the reasons that a lot of people like course books. They like course books because they already know what's going to happen. That is called a predetermined outcome. And they already know what kind of grammar is inside of that book. Chapter 1 is going to be about the present simple, and chapter 2 is going to be about the past simple. Chapter 3 is going to maybe lead them to something more complicated like the present perfect. And teachers like that, especially teachers who believe that grammar should be the center point of teaching and learning a language. Well, listeners, tonight, I want to say that it's not. And grammar should never be the number one thing that we should be doing with students. Now, I'm not saying that grammar is not important, because it is. But how we teach grammar and how people learn grammar should be in a natural way. And we're going to talk about how do we do that. Number 11, teach learners indirectly on how task-based learning works and how project-based learning works. Again, many of you might be working what we know as Generation Z. And many of you are working with millennials. Some of you might even be millennials. And the thing is, we need to understand how these generations learn. Generation Z, younger people, as we see as uh, uh, young learners, uh, they learn differently than millennials, and they have different needs. And we need to be aware of how they learn, because we need to be preparing them for life and what life really is going to throw at them when they enter the work world. And one of the most basic things that people who go on the job need to understand is that work means complicated processes that need to be completed. We call those tasks. And this is why task-based learning is extremely important, and that we understand that it's not only important, but we have to integrate it in how we teach. And the last point here is support our learners' second language ego development. Now, I'm not only a teacher, and I did work all over the world before I entered actually teaching full time. I was a human resource developer in London and worked for a very large company who had 120,000 employees. I worked in the personnel department, and my job was to recruit, hire, and train all the new employees that came into the company. And I had to travel all over the world doing this job. And it just became so interesting for me on how to work with people and all the different needs that every individual brings to the table. Now, I speak 4 languages. I come from a family that's very mixed. And so I just grew up with languages, and languages for me were, something natural. And I learned languages in a natural way because they were part of my culture and part of my heritage. But not everybody has that. And people, when they start learning another language, they start to feel that maybe their personalities change as they learn this other language, but it doesn't. Uh, I became so interested in that I went on to do my PhD in organizational psychology and a second PhD in educational psychology, which helped me to better understand exactly what was happening in the development of language within a person, an individual, and to understand that and compare that to my personal experience of how I learned a language. So if you don't understand what second language ego development is, why don't you Google first language ego development, and then that will help you to understand second language ego development. Well, this is about mind maps this evening, and I want to show you one of the most famous mind maps that has ever been created by one of the men who helped mentor me into understanding the concept of mind maps. Now, what you're seeing here is done by Tony Buzan. It's very colorful, it's beautiful. I was so taken by the idea of mind maps in the early 90s that I wanted to incorporate that at the business school that I was teaching at here in Germany. And I found it to be very interesting, and the students loved it. It was very creative. They got to, brainstorm. And what you're looking at here is actually the result of a very long brainstorming session. And then, of course, it's moved on to create a beautiful poster. But after about several years of doing this into the classroom, or doing this in the classroom with my students, I started to ask myself, is this really bringing students to a higher level of understanding the English language and using it in a natural way? And what are we really reaching? I got to the point where I started to think, maybe this might not be the right way to go. So I was influenced by Tony Buzan, who created the concept of mind maps, but I wanted to go a little bit further. So now we look at this beautiful poster, very colorful, and this is what's called graphic facilitation. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. It is used all over the world, but usually used by companies. There's an artist who's sitting in the back of the room or the side of the room, and he's creating this huge poster, which of course companies pay a lot of money for to have this done. But now, if you were not in the room when this meeting or conference or workshop was taking place, then the poster serves you no purpose. So again, it's very popular right now. You see this all over the world. And I thought, oh, maybe I could use that inside my classroom. But I took a few steps back, looked at the posters, and asked myself, could I use that in my classroom to really guide a learning cycle? Could I use that to do task-based learning and project-based learning? And sad but true, but I came to the conclusion uh, of no, that while they're beautiful, they're really not productive tools to be using in the learning cycle. Well, let's get to the basics of what learning should be and what skills we should be incorporating into the uh, language learning cycle. We've learned that we have the active skills and the passive skills. We have speaking, we have writing, we have listening, we have reading. And I always call grammar the fifth skill because I don't forget grammar. And like I said, I do speak four languages, and I might not be perfect in grammar in Spanish or in French. And maybe my grammar is a little bit better in German, but I definitely understand how grammar works in the languages. But I've learned them from a natural way, and I can never forget that when I'm teaching a language, I need to always ask myself, how am I integrating the four skills into language learning? Is it the traditional approach, or could I take another approach to doing it? And the answer was yes, that I could take a different approach. Well, another thing that we need to always look at when we're teaching languages, and now we come into something which is called 21st century skills. We need to ask ourselves as a teacher, are we incorporating the four C's of learning into what's going on in the classroom? Are we including collaboration? Now, when I say the word collaboration, I do not mean collaboration between the teacher and the learner, because that, of course, is teacher-centered. We want to do student-driven learning, student-centered learning, and collaboration from the perspective of the four C's means that we should have the students collaborate with one another and ask ourselves, are we doing that in our learning cycle? Are we creating opportunities and chances for our students to collaborate with one another? Also scientifically proven is that students learn more from each other and they teach each other, they mentor each other, they coach each other. And this is something that maybe is getting missed in the learning cycle. What about creativity? Are we allowing our students to be creative? And if we are, how? Are we creating activities for them other than games and crossword puzzles and fill in the blank? Uh, that's not really creative. We need to move to something a little bit higher. And what about those skills that they have and they bring to the table? And they just want to use those things and be creative. Some students like to draw, some students like to do other things, and they can use their creativity in so many different ways. And maybe we're not taking advantage of that. So, again, one of the other things, what about communication? How are we getting our students to learn the skills of communication? As I've traveled around the world and met many different teachers, I see how they teach, and I compare that to what I'm doing in the classroom. But the difference between many teachers who learned how to be a teacher is they might be good with some didactical and pedagogical things, but they forget about the skill of communication. And communication is a skill, and there's many different things how we break communication down. Now, if you're doing exam-oriented learning, you do need to ask yourself, how am I integrating that into the preparation of an exam? Because that is one thing that is tested in exams. And what about critical thinking? Are we getting our learners to higher levels of thinking, problem solving, decision making? And some people will argue that multiple choice tests and gap exercises and crossword puzzles is critical thinking. And, I don't want to disagree with them totally because there are some aspects that are that way. But critical thinking is a little bit more and more complicated than just thinking about what answer is right. So again, before we move on to this right here, are we integrating the four C's of the 21st century skills into our learning cycles? Now, Mind maps and ready-made mind maps and the concept that I created is based on task-based learning. And this is where I separate with many teachers because this is something that maybe they don't have that much experience with, and they don't know how to tell the difference between an activity and a task. And we'll talk about that. But task-based learning is not a new concept. It's been around for centuries. We, from the psychological standpoint, know it as cognitive apprenticeship, where a master teaches a younger person, an apprentice, how to do something, how to learn something in a step-by-step process. This is what's called learning by doing. But when we talk about learning by doing, we forget something that happens before learning by doing, and that's learning by seeing. A cognitive apprenticeship is not successful if we don't model. So part of cognitive apprenticeship is first learning by seeing, of course, observing how somebody does something. And then the teacher takes a few steps back and then lets the students do it. So modeling is very important. So we have to ask ourselves, are we modeling for our students? Are we a good model for them? Because they will copy what they see. Now, in the early 90s, Jane Willis came out with a very famous book, which did change the way language teaching and learning was happening. She wrote a book called A Framework for Task-Based Learning, and this was just very quickly accepted into the education world of how we could teach languages by task-based learning. Well, we've come a long way now, and it's almost been 40 years, and task-based learning has changed and developed, and there's different kinds of task-based learning. And one of the things that the Jane Willis left open was she called a task had to have an outcome, and that left for many different interpretations of what an outcome is. Now, what I'm going to be presenting to you tonight as I show you the mind maps is that for me, an outcome must be something which is called a product. And I'm going to talk to you about what a product is. Now, another concept that's integrated into ready-made mind maps is the idea of project-based learning. Uh, are we creating little projects for our students where we can actually lead them through an inquiry-based approach to start being able to get brave and take risk and chances and start using their voice and student agency to make choices for themselves? Are we getting them to collaborate with one another? Are we getting them to create content instead of us just giving them the content? Turn to page 8 in the book, and we see that as content. Well, task-based learning and project-based learning doesn't define content in that way. Students are creating the content, not the teacher. What about reflection? Are we getting them to reflect on how they learn, how they do things, how they solve problems, and why they make the decisions that they make? Now, of course, any product that's created during a task-based learning cycle and a project-based learning cycle must be publicly presented, or it's not valid, because this is part of just the process of learning, that what they've created, they show to other people and they explain it. This is the speaking part, the presentation part of it. We do not forget the other skills that led to that, but they need something that they can show the teacher or their fellow students in order for it to be assessed. Then we talk about feedback and revision. Do we just let them present something and give them feedback, or do we allow them to correct their mistakes and make it better? This is the idea behind task-based learning, that the final product is really not final. It's the same way in the real world. When someone works at a company and they don't do something correct, they get a little bit of feedback from their manager, and the manager says, go back and correct it, and when you're finished, come back and show me. Well, a teacher should be operating the same way. Now, we get into the last point here, and that is employability. Is education, language education, really about employability? Well, coming from my perspective, my answer is yes. Now, I do work at a major university with over 50,000 students. We have 3,800 professors and teachers, and we always work very closely with private industry to make sure what is it that private industry needs. And they tell us what it is. And we as professors have to learn to incorporate that into what we're teaching students, because at the end of the year, or at the end of the time or their studies when they graduate from university, we want them to be able to get a job. And in today's world, getting a job also means being able to speak English. Now, there are many skills that are involved in project-based learning. Here they are here: time management, multitasking, communication, are they organized, how they solve problems, and teamwork. And are we, incorporating these skills, and they are skills, into the language learning cycle. Now, all ready-made mind maps do use the concept of inquiry-based learning. I had several teachers, by the way, some of them were from Egypt, and they said that they didn't understand the concept of inquiry-based learning, and that while it sounded very interesting to them, they felt that because they had a pre-given curriculum and a syllabus that they had to work with, that they really couldn't incorporate that into their classroom. Well, that's not really true, because we always ask students questions, but are we asking them questions that are going to bring them to higher levels of thinking? And of course, that brings us to the point of product. What is a product? Well, a product could be an essay, could be a 150-word essay. It could be a presentation. It could be the development of an app. It could be many, many different things. But we need to ask ourselves, if we're doing task-based learning and if we're doing project-based learning, a product is not a test. It's actually something that students created themselves, where they thought it out, and we help them to do that. So at the end, they create something that they felt they were a part of, and that maybe didn't come from a book, because a lot of times products are not related to a book and the product creation. Well, we've got to get our students out of the comfort zone that they walk into, and they're going to feel a little bit of fear and feel a little bit not so secure about themselves. And our job as a teacher is to move them to the learning zone so that they acquire new skills, and that we throw some challenges at them, throw them some problems that they have to solve, and start being able to think in the language. And here I have to say, it's okay for students to make mistakes with grammar. Communication becomes very important here. Comfortability levels become very important. And it's our job to move students to the growth zone so that they find purpose in what they're doing, and they set new goals for themselves, and they're able to conquer some of the personal learning objectives that they bring to the classroom. And here is a model that I use all the time. And now I am the owner of 3 schools, 3 private schools in Germany. And I have over 120 teachers who work for me. And I interview teachers all the time. In this business, of course, we always have to keep a teacher's pool. And so during the interview, I always ask teachers, what's your TPAC? And many teachers are shocked because they've never heard the word before. But I would like for you to please write that down and look to see what TPAC is, because all teachers should know the answer to that question. What is my TPAC? In other words, TPAC is a combination of my pedagogical skills and what I bring to the table and how I understand pedagogy in the context of language learning. And then what about content? Do I have to be a master in everything that I teach? Well, the answer is no. And what about technology? And we see now in today's reality that technology is extremely important. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we use technology in the learning cycle? Are we being actually, up to date, using state-of-the-art things? And when I say technology, I don't mean things like using every single function of Zoom or all of those things, because I don't really think that you need all of that. I think that if we just use the simple things like breakout rooms, learning how to use Zoom, what about apps? Are we using any apps in the learning cycle? These are things that we need to ask ourselves that makes learning interesting, especially for Generation Z and millennials. And no matter what kind of technology you use, it's all worthless if you don't understand content and methodology. And please remember that when you walk into the classroom is what about content and what about methodology and who's creating the content and what methodologies am I using to help my students create content. Uh, Teachers are just not teachers. They're also coaches and they're mentors. And here is a mind map. And by the way, you are going to, get a copy of this right here and of these mind maps right here. And so you can always find them on my internet site in case you want to refer to them again. That's how you will get them. And please look at this right here, because this is really the cycle of what should be going on inside of a learning. It's not just about, I need to prepare my students for the test, and that is what language learning is about, because it's much more complicated than that. It's about being be able to direct students, show them their potential, support them, make them goal-oriented, and step away from teaching and get into training and teach them other skills, keep them motivated, and always give them feedback and advice of how they can improve themselves. And eventually, they will feel a sense of success, what we call as efficacy, and you will get a sense of success. And those are the things, the dynamics that steer a very positive learning dynamic in your classroom or online. Well, we always say to ourselves, what are we really doing in the classroom? And if you really think about it, we're getting students to tell stories, and we have to learn how to teach them how to be effective in storytelling, because that's what they're presenting. That's the product that they're going to be talking about. And storytelling is really a product. Okay, something that they create. And we can't use the word speaking because it's not that simple. I am going to move on to here. And I would just like to say that here we see, as I've observed, thousands, not hundreds, but thousands, because I usually train about 5,000 teachers every year. And I have to say that one of the things that I notice is that when I'm observing teachers, that sometimes the classroom is like one boat and all the students are in the classroom and the teacher's blindly steering them some way, and the students don't know where everything is going and they get lost, and the teacher's lost as well too. And I always ask the teacher, what was your learning objective? What did you want to reach today? And then I can see that they weren't able to do that. So everybody's on this boat and everybody's blind, but we need to move from that kind of way to, why don't we see it as us teaching them how to drive? And eventually we can talk about driving and show them all the theory, talk about it, ask them questions. But we got to get them to the point where they're going to feel comfortable and safe with us in the car, where they take over the driving. We put them behind the steering wheel, and we just sort of guide them, and they learn how to do it by themselves. And that's what I see as what we're really doing in the classroom. So before we move to the ready-made mind maps, I just want to review to you that was a very basic theory of what led to the mind maps and the creation of those, and why they're so powerful to use in the classroom. Well, we always start with this one right here, and fasten your seatbelts because this is going to go fast. This is what you see as a ready-made mind map, and this is the first one that I send to students. And I ask them questions to lead them to the point of what's called metacognition. In other words, thinking about how they do things and why they do the things they do. young learners as well as the university students and adults know the answers to these questions, and we must get them to the point of answering those questions. So this is the first one that I throw at students, and this is how I start with students. I start with a ready-made mind map, but then I move them on to something which is called experiential learning. In other words, they can talk about experiences that they have from their world, and not us moving them into a world that they don't understand, like talking about England, London, and when they've never even been there. But they can talk about things that they've experienced, like maybe a restaurant, maybe their favorite place that they like to go with their family. They can talk about that. They just need a little bit of guidance. And this is why we use the inquiry-based approach. You will notice that the boxes are numbered. It starts on the right-hand side and goes to the left, because they're like clocks. And clocks move forward, they don't move backwards. So what you're looking at is a ready-made mind map that's been chunked. You can decide how you do it. There's questions, and the students start to answer the questions and write them down and create sentences. And this is where the language teaching comes in, that grammar that comes in, because each one of the boxes, as you see here, elicits a different kind of grammar and vocabulary. Here, another thing, it's about their world, and it's about them talking about how they understand their world. This is, again, another experiential oriented mind map, where we have them talk about their local community and area in a step-by-step basis. If you're talking about a student who lives in Cairo, I wonder how many students could really talk about Cairo from a demographics perspective, geographical. What about the economy of Cairo, the infrastructure? Number two, what about the history and the culture of it? And what can they talk about that? And some educational highlights, like maybe universities there. Number three, getting them to move on here. You know, again, this is scaffold. We take one bubble at a time. And this is not called a lesson. This is called a learning cycle. But we're leading them to something. And what is that we're leading them to? We're leading them to create a product. And what could be the product of this learning cycle? Maybe they write an essay. Maybe they write a letter to maybe one of the local officials. Maybe they write a letter to a newspaper. And that's the product. And while they're going through this mind map, they're doing something which is called language emergence. In other words, they're creating the language sentence by sentence, bubble by bubble, and they're writing everything down. And we as teachers are helping them to create that. They see what the goal is. The focal point is always in the middle, and they never lose sight of the goal, but they always have to think about what product they're creating, because this is what they will present to us, this is what they will create, and that's the content creation, bubble by bubble, and then the product itself. Well, here we start to get them to talk about status symbols. And here we see that if we look at this mind map, with the green bubble is going to be where we start them into the warm-up. And then we break them down into groups. And this is a great mind map to use to flip the classroom, where the pink one, number two, is about gender perspectives of status symbols. Number three is going to be the cultural perspective of status symbols. And number four actually has two perspectives. We have a business perspective, and then we have a historical perspective. So we can add perspective into the learning cycle. We can assign each group or each student a different task, but we all know that we're working on one thing together. And then, of course, number five, the bubble, is the personal storytelling that takes part, and which should take part when people express their personal opinions about things. So what you're looking at here is, again, experiential, and we're teaching them things, but they're learning about something that affects them. And no matter what country or culture you're from, status symbols is a very important part of our lives. Well, everybody has culture, and they want to talk about their culture. And this is something that, one of the mind maps that we can use inside of the learning cycle. And this one is a little bit complicated. It needs some explanation. And I have to say that I've realized that we're probably going to have a couple of more sessions on how to really use these effectively. And I'm willing to do that. We need to talk about the media. Are we talking about that? Here's a ready mind map that guides and steers that learning cycle. So students start to create language. Language emergence happens. But what you don't see on any ready-made mind map is going to be the warm-up cycle that teachers choose for themselves because they know their students, and the product. Teachers can choose the product. Well, why don't we let voice and choice happen and let the students choose what they want to create from what they see here? We can talk about fake news. This mind map I created for a lesson in February, just this year, and was downloaded from the internet over 500,000 times. Everybody can talk about sleep. We know about sleep because we all sleep. 1/3 of our life is spent sleeping. And we need to talk about that. It's such thing that we know about it, but have we ever looked at it from these perspectives? Makes for a great, interesting learning cycle. And here, each bubble is put in a way where we can assign each student a different task. Again, we stay focused on the topic and the theme, and we let students create little projects for themselves around this that they present in class. This is what makes language learning interesting. This is what keeps motivation going inside the classroom, and students feel that they're a part of the learning process, that they're not only just the passive recipients of information that's being thrown at them, but they are the ones who are creating what's really happening in the classroom. Such a great mind map to use in the classroom. Well, students, go through transitions. I have to say that I do teach international students at the university. I get a lot of students from Egypt. And, when we sit down and we talk about what's going on, many of them who come from Muslim countries, this is their first time outside of the country, and this is their first time being away from home. And something's going on in their life, and they need to talk about it. So we want to meet students where they find themselves. And sometimes they need to learn to use language in a different way, to talk about how they're feeling and about their emotions and where they find themselves. And leaving the nest, of course, leaving home, is something that they learn to talk about. And they love talking about this. Well, meaningful learning. There's 5 points of meaningful learning. Is it active? Is it collaborative? Is it constructive? Is it authentic? And is it goal-oriented? These are the 5 aspects of meaningful learning that we should be integrating into the classroom. Let me show you what I mean by what a mind map can do and how powerful it is when we're talking about meaningful learning. One of the skills that students need to learn is teamwork. They will not have success if they don't understand the concept of teamwork and what's going to be required from them in real life. So we need to teach them that as young learners, and we need to teach them that from the perspective of learning to work with each other first. So when they get into the real world, that they learn how to that they know what teamwork is, what is expected out of them, and understand the concept of teamwork so that they can feel successful and climb the ladder of success in the corporate world. This mind map helps to do that. We need to teach students about job satisfaction and what makes them happy and what makes them unhappy, and to talk about that and the emotions that are involved in job satisfaction. If you look at bubble number 6, you will see that we talk about theories, of course, using the inquiry-based approach here. We always ask questions which engage them. In other words, not just questions that they automatically know the answers to, but questions that would lead them to research and discover for themselves of what job satisfaction is and the theories behind job satisfaction and where they find themselves in their life when it comes to being happy with what they do or unhappy with what they do, and of course helps them to choose careers. Researching a company, we need to teach students how business works, and this is not about teaching business English. This is just about how the real world works. This mind map guides them through that process and helps them to research a company. They create a product and then they present that in class. Well, we need to teach students to talk about, themselves in a very personal way. This one is one of the first ones that I created in 1994 for a business school. It became so successful that I never changed it. You will see that I take a very holistic approach to creating them. And I just leave them natural in my own writing. They have been digitalized by a publishing company, which, of course, the publishing company will come out with those and put those online, and I think next spring. When I met people, young people, and asked them questions during a job interview when I was a human resource manager, I always asked them the simple question, well, tell me something about yourself. And I was always surprised how unprepared students were uh, and how they didn't know the answer to that question. Now, this mind map right here was created for a colleague of mine in London, and she wanted to talk about the elevator pitch. She said that it was a very important thing, and it is. And this is taught at all business schools. It is taught, of course, at high schools throughout the United States, North America, and all English-speaking countries, where we teach students at an early age to talk about themselves. What is number two? What is their unique selling point? How do they stand out? What makes them different? What do they do? Why do they do things? What motivates them? So when they're asked the question, tell me something about themselves, they've created content, they've practiced that, and they've mastered this skill so they can move forward in their life. Maybe this one mind map will help them to get a job. Well, we talk about global issues, and, I said something about millennials and Generation Z, but do they themselves understand that they are these people? And what do sociologists and psychologists and statisticians and business people think about these generations? So this is something that's going to help them to understand a global phenomena about millennials and Generation Z and how we're incorporating them into the real world and how we need to satisfy their needs. And they're very different than my generation, which is a baby boomer. So we have different ways of teaching them different things. And are we using these kinds of topics to teach them language in a very indirect way? The gig economy. I will tell you that most of your students, if we look at the statistics, and I don't know what they are for Egypt or other countries in the Middle East or North Africa, but I can say one thing, that many of your students will be part of the gig economy, and they need to understand how that works. I left this one in its very natural state to show you how I create these. These have been, of course, updated. Excuse me. And we could use this to interest and motivate students, get them to create a product, some kind of presentation, or maybe just a simple essay. But they do need to learn what that is. Well, it gets us to the end here. And I have to say that just like I start with metacognition, I use a mind map to get people to talk about how they think about learning, how they understand what learning is, and how they learn. I also get them to reflect with a mind map. And this right here is the one that I use at the end of any learning cycle, is I ask the students to try to answer these questions for me, to tell me what they've discovered about themselves. Did they learn something new? And not from a language perspective, because please don't forget they're answering these questions in English, and that in and of itself is also a very high level. They might make grammar mistakes, they might make some vocabulary mistakes, but we need to be understanding when it comes to language emergence, and let them build their second language ego and feel secure in the language. Because I have to say that as a person who's traveled around the world to many different countries and a person who does speak many different languages, I might not be 100% in my, French grammar, but I can say that when I'm speaking French or when I'm speaking Spanish or German, people understand what I'm saying. And communication is the most important thing, and not grammar. Grammar is important, but it has its place and it has its time. And we cannot overteach grammar because we're going to be demotivating our students. So start with a mind map, use a mind map to steer, and use a mind map to end. On that point, I come back to where I started, and that is, if you really want to know if you're being effective, if you're reaching the point of efficacy, and efficacy is that pedagogical word for success, the feeling of success, the feeling that you've reached something. I started with these 12 points, and these are the 12 points you should ask yourself when you reflect about your teaching practice, what you're doing face to face or online. Ask yourself, are you flipping the classroom? How are you driving the learning cycle? Is it just from the book? Are you creating positive learning dynamics? Are you promoting existing skill sets and teaching them to learn other things? Are we chunking that learning session? And are we respecting our learners and the preferences they bring to the table? Uh, how are we dealing with differentiated learning? And are we taking advantage of the experience that they bring to the classroom? Are we staying focused? And are we result oriented? And result oriented doesn't mean that they passed the test. It means that they created content and were able to present that content and answer questions. Are we putting some life into that book and going away from the book and really getting to what is really real learning? And are we getting away from predetermined outcomes? This is what I want you to do. That's what you have to do. Instead of, and then move away from that and say, well, what do you want to do? And have them explain that to you. Let them decide about the outcomes. Now, with exam-oriented learning, we know we can't do that, but there's ways to get around that. And are we just prescribing the grammar to them, saying, today we're going to do the present perfect continuous? Nobody walks around speaking in the present perfect continuous. We walk around with mixed grammar, and we should always take mixed grammar approaches to teaching grammar. And how are we teaching them about understanding tasks and projects? Because that's the real world that they're going to enter. And are we helping them to develop their second language ego? That's where I stop. And I would like to say thank you very much for coming to today's session. If you would like to contact me, I do answer all my emails. Of course, I have students who help me to filter them. But this is right here my personal email address that I get questions to. And if you want a copy of those mind maps, I freely give them and share them with my colleagues all over the world. And you can find those at my internet site under Mind Maps. Thank you very much for coming this evening. And now we move back to Anan.
Yes, thank you so much, Ron. Actually, it was an amazing session, fruitful one. Thank you for your effort.
So do we have any questions that we would like to answer today?
Yeah, sure. We have many. Yes. Marwa? Hello? Marwa, can you share your screen, please?
Yes, sure. Yes, sure.
Thank you. Kindly, if you have any questions, just write it down, dears, okay? Okay,
wow,
great.
That's great.
Thank you, Marwa.
Barbara,
yes.
You're fantastic.
Yeah, we are tracking.
This is such a fantastic team. I just think you're absolutely marvelous. Okay.
Thank you so much. We are
So
tracking them.
let's get with the first question here, and that first question is, how can we implement mind mapping in teaching and learning? Well, I'm going to say that I am very just. It's just probably a wonderful thing that I met Anan and Mavra and this wonderful team in Cairo, because I have a feeling that we're going to do some more workshops online, with RELO and your mentor group, because answering the question of how do we implement them means we got to get into the concept of how do we create them first, and we have a workshop that we can do with you. We can just set a date, and really get into how we really implement them. But before we implement them, we have to create them, because I want teachers not only to use my mind maps. What I showed you this evening are the ones I created for my learning sessions. They're not the silver bullet. You can use your own, and you can create your own, because you know your students and you know what they need. So before implementing, we have to create. And we're going to solve that problem by setting a date in the future where we can do and learn how to create them. The second question is, should we use preset mind maps or brainstorm or list it together with students? Well, of course. of course, that's the whole idea behind that, is to get students to learn how to mind map and brainstorm. We can learn from our students, and by brainstorming with them, creating questions where they have to find the answer to, that's what real collaborative learning is about. We put them in groups and we teach them how to mind map. But remember, it's about task-based learning and project-based learning. So while we can get them to brainstorm and mind map and create those and feel very successful, what's going to be the product? Marva, can you go back to the top of the document again, please, a little bit?
Yes, sure.
Mm-hmm. The other question, do we have a link to download those mind maps? I just gave you the link. You can get that. And I can give that to Anan again, where she can send that to you from my internet site where you can download them. They are free for you to download and use in the classroom. Some of them already come with lesson plans, by the way.
Great.
Somebody asked the question, are there apps to create mind maps? Well, of course there is. You can use Word document. You can use many different apps. You can go to the internet and find those. But I believe in the holistic creation of them. In other words, creating them by hand. If you go to my Facebook site, and I invite all of you to come and follow me on Facebook, I use my Facebook as a blog, and I try to stay away, always stay away from politics and religion and all of these things, but I share a lot of pedagogical and didactical, things which I find very interesting. And of course, about how to create the mind maps. And you're going to see some wonderful pictures when you go there of how I do it. So I'm not going to show you now. Go to my Facebook site and see them, because you'll see how I create them. Another question that we have here is, what's the name of the book? Okay, well, there's so many books about mind mapping. And the book that will be coming out in spring is put out by Express Publishing. And you're going to be able to get a lot of mind maps from that, okay? But, let's think about, doing a future workshop on how to create them yourself. I'm not asking anybody to run in and buy a book. Somebody asked the question, can we use mind maps to teach grammar? Well, of course we can. But I believe in cognitive grammar. In other words, the natural approach to grammar. And think about, how did you learn your mother language? Did your parents give you a worksheet with fill in the blank and multiple choice? Well, of course they didn't. You learned it in a natural way and in a natural state and environment. And this is what ready-made mind maps are about. It's just, I'd always say, let grammar happen. Don't teach it unnaturally first and then expect them to use it. Let them figure out for themselves. Let them make mistakes. And when they make the mistakes, jump in as a teacher and correct. And that's what I mean by letting grammar happen. Could you tell us about flipping the classroom? Well, please, of course, Google the flipped classroom. And actually, I use the mind maps to help to flip the classroom. And when I say classroom, I always am very clear about this. It's not only face-to-face, it's also online learning. How do you flip that and go away from just being the center of attention and let the students be the center of attention, use the breakout rooms and flip everything around so that they're collaborating with each other? And what is TPAC? Well, of course, TPAC is an acronym for Technology, Pedagogy, and Content Knowledge. Please Google that, because that could be by itself just a workshop. But when you talk about TPAC, remember, ask yourself the question, what is my TPAC? Because every teacher should know the answer to that. Somebody asked a wonderful question. Is a mind map similar to a lesson plan? The answer is yes. It is the lesson plan. This is where teachers get confused. They think they have to create some elaborate lesson plan. This is the thing and wonderful phenomena that happens with ready-made mind maps is students don't understand what's going on in the classroom. They don't know what it's leading to. And we as teachers need to demystify all of those things. And there's nothing better to demystify the learning process than a ready-made mind map. Do you think using mind maps is suitable for any content of language that suits all ages? Yes. and no. Okay. I always separate myself from teachers who are teaching A1 and A2 learners. In other words, really beginners, because beginners, and in order to be successful with beginners, they have very special needs. They really do need grammar. They really do need vocabulary, and they need different strategies. And we as teachers have to develop different strategies for beginner learners. But that changes with B1, B2, C1, and C2. I use the European Framework of Languages to refer to different levels. We as teachers should know those, okay? Because if you're working with exam-oriented learning and you're using international exams like IELTS or Cambridge or TELC or any TOEIC and all of those, they do use those levels, and we as teachers need to know what each level requires. But I think that ready-made mind maps and the concept of TBL and PBL, when we use ready-made mind maps to guide those methodologies, they are very powerful and keep students focused on that. Most institutions expect teachers to focus on grammar, otherwise they will protest, claiming that the students are not learning properly. Well, I have to say one thing. I do own 3 schools, and part of the product that we offer at one of my schools is tutoring for young learners. And we know that we have to cater to that because that's what the teachers are asking them to do. But I want to say one thing. I have direct contact with the Ministry of Education here, and I'm always telling them that grammar is not the most important thing. But, you know, the textbook industry is the one who controls that, and the testing agencies. And it's because they put an emphasis on it that we believe that we should. So be brave, take risk, and create other opportunities for learning other than just grammar. And I think I can handle just a couple of more questions here. Maverick, can we design a whole lesson with mind maps instead of a lesson plan? Yes, that's the whole idea of ready-made mind maps. If you can create a ready-made mind map and you know what you want to do and you really think about the logic of how you and the order and how you structure those questions, because we do use inquiry-based approaches to creating them, you've got to learn a little bit about what inquiry-based approach means. And how you guide them and use them to guide the students in chunks. And that's why we use different bubbles right there. So the answer to that question is yes, yes, and yes. The ready-made mind map is the lesson plan. It is what steers and guides it, and it helps the students to create content. So, and they're wonderful tools to be using. That's why I always say the power of them. Do I suggest educational apps using mind maps for students? Well, you know, again, sometimes students get into so many, and teachers as well, they get into the technology of it and then forget the actual goal and the content, and they get preoccupied with the technology. This is why I do not promote technological applications to create the mind maps in the beginning. I do have some that I created with technology, but that is always the goal, is to first learn how to create them, the theory behind them, why they're a lesson plan, why they're important, how they're powerful, and learning about how to create a product and assess that before we move into the technology part. That is something that comes way at the end when a teacher has already become seasoned in learning how to use them. It's changing the way we believe, you know, how learning should work. Is there a difference between a mind map for lower classes? Well, of course. We can't use the same mind map for B1 as we're using for A1 and A2. When you're looking at really what is happening in A1 and A2, that's called situational learning. And of course, we do use situational learning in the other levels as well. But something that very young learners cannot bring to the table is life experience. And that's why we can't use the mind maps in the same way. Now, when you look at primary school, you know, experiential learning works, but it works in a totally different way. So Google what experiential learning is and Google how we use that with primary school students, and that will help to guide you into creating a mind map that's geared towards their special needs. Can we ask students to work in groups and try to design mind maps themselves? Again, we answered that question, but we'll answer it again. Yes. Okay. Yes, we can. And that's what we should be doing. Not just that we show them how my mind map works, let them create the lesson plan. Let them tell the teacher how they want to learn things. And by doing that, we bring them to higher levels of thinking. And one of the things that we will always encounter as teachers is, how do we get our students to think in English? There's no better way than a ready-made mind map. And the last question is, again, here somebody talked about apps. I do not believe that we should do digital mind mapping in the beginning. It should be a very holistic thing. Please go to my Facebook site and see all those things that I post in pictures of how I create all of those. And I do have templates, and I share those with teachers in the online workshops that we do. Anan, we come to the end of this session. I would like to thank you again very much.
Thank you so much.
I hope that people have the takeaway that they really can start to think about what they do in the classroom, how they do it, what they're doing, what they're leading to, and to incorporate different approaches and methodologies other than the textbook, because that's what it was all about.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. Actually, we can't thank you enough. Just wait a minute, guys. Don't write anything on the screen, please. We can't thank you enough. Thank you, Marwa, for sharing your the screen of the questions.
Most welcome. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you all my colleagues and team in our RELO Cairo Mentors platform. Thank you for our attendees. We just want to tell you a surprise for the next session. And I just want to clarify that you will find everything on our official page, RELO Cairo Mentors platform. For many details, we are going to upload the session recorded on our YouTube channel as well. And you will find everything on our Facebook page, okay? Okay, just now, Marwa, would you please stop sharing the screen? Yes. Now we have a surprise for you to announce. We have Dr. Hind Al-Khayal. She's going to tell you about the next session. Hello, Dr. Hind.
Hello. How
are you? Yeah, fun. Yeah, nice to hear from you.
Let me thank Dr. Ron very much. It was a very, very interesting presentation, and it was a very useful one too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And let me welcome everybody here. We'll have, mashallah, I can see that we have around 81, 82 participants in this meeting room. Thank you for attending this wonderful session.
Yes.
And as a presentation to mine, which will take place on Tuesday,
yes,
Tuesday, same timing, inshallah, like 10 to 12. I just wanted to know how many English teachers do we have in this room? So if you're an English teacher, kindly write down number 1 in the chat box. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Just write down number 1 in the chat box if you're an English teacher.
Wow. We're going to have 101.
Yeah, I know.
101. Great.
Yeah, like, you know, oh, mashallah, most of them are English teachers.
Yeah, that's great.
Not all. If not all, oh my God. Okay. Thank you very much. It seems that everybody's an English teacher, except for 1 or 2 members. All right, that's wonderful.
That's fine.
Look, this means that I believe most of you have had the situation when you saw that, or when you observed that one or 2 or a couple of your students are falling asleep during your session. Yeah, did it happen before?
Sure.
It must have happened before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes you feel like the children, or no matter what group age you're teaching, sometimes if you're a young learner teacher or adult teacher, I mean, like you're teaching to adults, sometimes you feel like they're not very interested, or they're not very excited while teaching, especially if you have had your lessons in a classroom, not a virtual classroom like what we're having now. Yeah.
Yes.
Have you ever wondered why does this happen? Honestly speaking, sometimes we as teachers feel like, oh,
we have boredom, exhausted students. Yes.
You start doubting yourself, and you start doubting, oh my God, is it because of me? Am I a boring teacher? Did I turn into a boring teacher? Yeah, I need to, sometimes you need to ignite their interest, and you need to do something that is that makes them more into the lesson. Oh yes, demotivated. Yes, thank you very much.
The scaring, yes.
Life, yeah. So you need to ignite their interest, and you need to make them feel like more motivated and more into the lesson. Yes. Well, in my next session, inshallah, I'm going to provide you with 5 of the most effective online language resources. Actually, they are some of them are resources, and some others are platforms that you can use in your classroom so that you can engage your students, make them feel much more motivated to be engaged and to share whatever they have. Yeah? Oh, mashallah. Okay. Now look at the chat screen. A lot of people are writing many adjectives by which they can describe their children in this status. Yes.
Careless.
So, yes, we can see that some of them are saying they are careless. You feel like they are careless, or
tone of the voice like that. Yes.
Yeah, they lack activity, or they don't have the motivation. Yeah, I see. So many questions, but what really make us sometimes feel like a little bit, suspicious about our abilities. The first thing we think of is my teaching is not as good as I wanted it to be. Maybe the lecture is a little bit boring because I wasn't well prepared, or I don't have the tools. Next session, I'm going to give you some tools by which you can easily engage your students while teaching, whether you're teaching language like grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation. Other platforms will help you a lot in engaging your students while teaching, also reading, speaking, or listening. All right? So wait for us, and I promise you will have a wonderful session, inshallah, that will be very, very much satisfying for everyone and very useful too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Al-Khayal. Thank you so much, Ron. Dr. Ron, thank you so much. We can't thank you enough. Thank you all.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the team. You're absolutely marvelous.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's our pleasure. Thank you for all our attendees. We'll see you soon, inshallah, next Tuesday. Don't miss our session with Mrs. Al-Khayal at 10 p.m. Waiting you all. And see you soon, inshallah. Goodbye.